Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. This is Dr. Muhammad Shafiq, lecturer of philosophy at Department of Islamic and Pakistan Studies, CUST. The course I'm teaching is called Kalam in Philosophy of Islam, and the course code is ISL 471. This is lecture number 20, one of the series lectures of epistemology. We are trying to look into different theories of knowledge in the branch of philosophy which is called epistemology. And today we are going to look into two theories which are called logical positivism and foundationalism in epistemology. So this lecture is we would try to explain what is logical positivism and foundationalism in philosophy.
Move to the next slide. These are the outlines of today's lecture. What is logical positivism? Why logical positivism? And what is foundationalism? And the outcomes of today's lecture. Now, what is logical positivism? So, students, logical positivism is a philosophical movement, a Western philosophical movement that started in 1920s. With the central thesis of the verification principle. So, actually, that was a movement, and a group of philosophers and scientists started that movement, which lasted till 1936. In this particular movement, as it was developed by so many philosophers and scientists, the most famous philosophers and scientists are like Maurice Schlick, Rudolf Carnap, William Orman Quine, and many others of the Vienna Circle as well. That was known as actually a Vienna Circle because the movement took birth in Vienna, and there was a sort of group discussion among those philosophers and scientists. So one of the reasons of that discussion was that why philosophy is lagging behind all other sciences. So they came up with a kind of solution that philosophy lags behind all the sciences because philosophy doesn't have any proper methodology. There are so many methodologies used in philosophy, but science has its own particular methodology. And the second issue was that of human language, because human language is used most of the time ambiguously and vaguely. Suppose a philosopher means something else, but when he is understood by someone else, so he or she may take a person may take its own meaning. So that is actually creating a kind of confusion. So in order to get rid of that confusion of language, they tried their level best to create an artificial language. Up to some extent, they were successful because nowadays we have that symbolic language. But in symbolic language, it's not a language, a complete language in which all our emotions can be expressed as well. So, what is that verification principle? The principle of verificationism. So, a statement is meaningful if and only it is either analytic or synthetically verifiable directly or indirectly. So, before understanding this definition, so we should understand first what is analytic statement and what is synthetic statements. Students, if you remember the different types of proposition I have already discussed, that analytical statement or analytic propositions are those propositions in which the predicate doesn't add additional information into the subject. For example, we have whiteboard is white. Now here white is actually not adding some additional information to the subject because the subject is already contained, the predicate is already contained in the subject. This is white is actually contained in the subject. So these types of proposition, analytical statements, or in other words, analytic statements or analytic propositions are actually true by their own definition or by their own meaning. we don't need any sort of experience. This type of distinction was actually made by the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant. So we may have another analytic statement like blackboard is black. Now blackboard is black, so the predicate black is actually contained in the subject black. If somebody knows about the meaning of blackboard, so definitely we don't need that predicate as well, because it's true by its own definition. Our bicycle has two wheels, or in geometry we can say a triangle is a geometrical shape that has three angles. So a geometrical figure that is known as triangle, which means a geometrical shape that has three angles. So these types of statements are actually true by their own definitions. They don't need any experience for its truth. They are true by their own meaning. Now, what is synthetic statement? The whiteboard is costly. Now, this is synthetic statement. Here, this is the predicate costly. Costly aids additional information into the subject, that is whiteboard. Now, this type of statement is actually, synthetic statements are actually not true by their own meaning. They are rather the needs for its truth, a kind of experience. Now, suppose if you want to know about whether it is true or false, suppose there is a group, there are a few persons, they want to know about whether the whiteboard is costly or not. So, what is costly? Suppose if they say that if the its price is more than 1,000, then it is costly. If it is less, then it is not costly. So it may be true or false by experiences. So most of the statements of science are actually synthetic in nature. So a statement is meaningful if and only it is either analytic, because those statements which are true by their own meaning, they can be true, or synthetically verifiable. Now the second part says synthetically verifiable directly or indirectly. So those synthetic statement actually needs kind of verification, and that is a sense experiences, kind of sensory experiences, or a kind of empirical verification. So this is about this principle. Now let's move to the next slide. So this principle has actually two different versions. One is a strong version and the other is a weak version. That's actually Ayer's version. So there were so many philosophers and scientists who contributed to the movement that is known as logical positivism. So for Ayer concluded a proposition is said to be verifiable in the strong sense of the term if and only if its truth could be conclusively established by experience. So it means that a proposition is said to be verifiable when it is its truth is established by experiences. In other words, we can say the truth should be an empirical one. It should be established by experiences, sensory organs. It may be direct or indirect. The weaker version, it's conclusively, it's totally established by experiences. The weaker version says a statement is said to be verifiable in the weak sense if it is possible for experience to render it probable. Now, there's a difference between these two terms, like conclusively. Conclusively means with certainty, with so much logical consistency. But probability means actually the likelihood of something to be true, though there are many definitions of probability. So a statement is said to be verifiable in the weak sense if it is possible for experience to render it probable. So if the experience render it probable, so then it is true. Now, what were the consequences of this principle of verification? Students, if this principle is applied in different areas of knowledge, suppose we have religion, we have metaphysics, we have ethics, and we have aesthetics. So logical positivist thought that actually, according to this principle of verification, religious statements are meaningless or pseudo statements, because religious statements cannot be verified uh, by experience. For example, if I say God exists, so we cannot verify God by experiences, though uh, we may have a proof according to coherence theory of truth, but it cannot be verified by experience. Like as far as we Muslim believe that there are two angels sitting on our shoulder, those two angels cannot be verified by experiences. So according to that principle of verificationism, so religious statements are pseudo statements. They don't have any factual meaning. Though this is a debated concept, later on, the famous philosopher G.E. Moore, in his famous work Principia Ethica, uh, he showed that religious statement, and which is known as postmodernism. So, in that postmodernism of G.E. Moore, actually, he restored the ancient position of the religion and ethics. So, for G. Moore, some of the statements are cognitively meaningful and some of the statements are factually meaningful. So let's forget about that debate. So in a nutshell, what I want to clear you that is that religious statements, according to logical positivists, are pseudo statements. They are not genuine statements. Why? Because they cannot be verified by principle of verification, the POV principle. The second one is metaphysical statements are also meaningless pseudo statements. So metaphysics, as you know, is a branch of philosophy which searches for the ultimate reality, which searches for something which is beyond material existence. So they thought that metaphysics is also a kind of subject whose statements are actually not genuine, but rather they are pseudo in nature, because most of the metaphysical principles or assumptions, they cannot be verified by that principle of verification that logical positivist has offered. Logical positivists have offered, especially that principle of AGA. Thirdly, ethical and aesthetical statements are cognitively meaningful but factually meaningless. So, actually, they were also pseudo statements for AGA, but there is this is a huge group of there are so many philosophers, and there is a kind of disagreement among those philosophers and scientists. For some, ethical and aesthetical statements are cognitively meaningful, but they don't have any factual meaning. They are factually meaningless. So, but for air, these are also actually pseudo statements. For example, what is good? Good is not something that can be verified by experience. Good is a notion. Good, because good is not a material object. Same is the case with aesthetical statements. So most of the aesthetical assumptions are also pseudo statement according to that principle of verificationism. Now, what is the main criticism upon that logical positivism? So, as far as metaphysicians are concerned, they think that metaphysics, being a branch of philosophy, is actually striving to know about what is meaningful and what is meaningless. Same is the spirit of the principle that was given by logical positivists. So, when you reject metaphysics, actually you yourself are doing metaphysics. So, because that the branch of philosophy, metaphysics, is also trying to know about what is meaningful and what is meaningless. So, rejecting metaphysics necessarily means doing metaphysics. The second criticism is that of self-incoherence. The principle in itself is self-incoherent. How? If you look at this principle, which was discussed in the previous slide, this principle is not analytic in nature. It's a synthetic statement. So, how this synthetic statement is justified. What is the justification of the principle in itself? So it needs another principle for its justification. So critics actually raise the point that when you apply this principle on its own self, it destroys its own self. So there is a kind of self-incoherence in the principle. Though some of the supporter of the logical positivist, they have their own argument that it is just like an eye which can see many things, but it cannot see itself. It is just like a weighing scale that can weigh many things, but it cannot weigh itself. But again, I would say that there is a kind of self-incoherence in that principle, because the principle needs itself to be verified. And what is the other principle that verifies the principle of verificationism? Next, it is foundationalism. So, according to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, foundationalism is a wave about the structure of justification or knowledge. The foundationalist thesis, in short, is that all knowledge or justified belief rests ultimately on a foundation of non-inferential knowledge or justified belief. So, from this definition, what we can get is that as far as our knowledge is concerned, we have so many beliefs in a set of system. So those justified beliefs are actually based on another belief that is known as foundational belief, and that foundational belief is actually non-inferential. We should assume it to be true. We should assume it to be self-evidently true. So, for example, we have religion. In religion, we have a foundational belief like God exists. Now, most of the time, those theologians, they don't bother about uh, to justify that belief, because for them, this belief is non-inferential knowledge, a kind of non-inferential and self-evidently true belief. Similarly, for materialist, matter is the prime stuff of this universe. For materialist, matter exists. Whether matter really exists or not, this is another question. But they think, the materialists, that it is the very foundation belief and it's self-evidently true. And it, for an idealist, it may be like ideas exist. Ideas are the prime stuff of this universe, or ideas are the primary source of our knowledge. So they take this very belief as foundational and the very basis of all other beliefs that are derived or infer from this basic belief. Example, we have religion, philosophical theories, as I explained it earlier, different theories in science. For example, we have different theories in science. If you study quantum particle physics, so quantum particle physics has its own foundational beliefs, and they consider those foundational beliefs as self-evidently true. They think that these beliefs are non-inferential in nature, and from on the basis of those foundational beliefs, some other beliefs are derived or inferred. We have Einsteinian theory of relativity, special theory of relativity, general theory of relativity, in which there are some basic we can say like postulates in mathematics or in science. So those principles are, they don't need any proof in order to be proven as true or false. They are actually self-evidently true. But one of the problems, students, that suppose there are so many religions like Christianity, Judaism. So Christianity has its own foundational beliefs. Judaism has its own foundational beliefs. But for Christians, those foundational beliefs may be true, but for Jews, those foundational beliefs may not be true. Same is the case with Muslims; they may not believe in those foundational beliefs. So a type of problems occur, and that is that whether that foundation belief is actually true or not. And this foundationalism was actually criticized by the famous philosopher of the 19th century Friedrich Nietzsche, he gave his own theory of anti-foundationalism, and according to Nietzsche, uh, there are no foundational beliefs, there are no absolute beliefs. All these beliefs are actually kind of perspectives. That's why for Nietzsche, knowledge is perspectivism. Knowledge is not something that is absolute in nature. There are different perspectives in order to explore the reality, or in order to explore this universe. So there are so many perspectives. Like, in other words, you can say there are so many foundation beliefs, but none of the foundation belief is actually absolute. Uh, it should not be considered as absolutely true. So they are actually kind of perspectives. And the main concern that foundational beliefs are arbitrary, as I mentioned it earlier in the previous slide. They are arbitrary because for a materialist, that foundation belief may be true. That foundation belief is true, but for idealist, it may not be true. For Darwin, the very foundation belief that life is the result of an accident. It is true, and Darwin considered it is true. It's self-evidently true. But for those who believe in creationism, this foundational belief may not be true. So foundationalism in itself is actually arbitrary. So this is all about today's lecture. These are the references. Thank you very much indeed.